The constable from the neighbouring town of Ashford arrived within the hour, a competent-looking man of middle years named Inspector Graves, whose practical demeanour immediately imposed a semblance of order upon the descending chaos. By this time, the garden party had been formally concluded, the white tables cleared away by anxious staff, and the guests shepherded into the drawing-room of Pemberton Manor with varying degrees of reluctance. James Kirkwood lay upstairs, undisturbed pending the coroner's arrival, while Inspector Graves established himself in Lady Pemberton's study with the methodical efficiency of someone accustomed to such grim duties. Miss Marple, having offered her quiet condolences to their bewildered hostess, had positioned herself in the drawing-room's corner beside the window, ostensibly absorbed in her knitting, yet acutely aware of every murmured conversation that drifted through the assembled group. The preliminary account, pieced together from Margaret's confused recollections and the observations of the first responders, painted a picture of tragic simplicity. Kirkwood had been shown to the guest room on the second floor by Lady Pemberton's housekeeper, Mrs. Finch, at approximately 2 o'clock, as he had expressed a desire to rest before dinner. At some point during the subsequent hour, he had apparently approached the casement window, perhaps to enjoy the view, and in a moment of carelessness or confusion had lost his balance and fallen to the terrace below. The drop was a considerable one, some 25 feet, quite sufficient to account for the injuries that had rendered him instantly lifeless. It was a narrative that satisfied most people's instinctive need for explanation. Accidents happened. Elderly men, for Kirkwood was discovered to be 63, sometimes became dizzy or disoriented. The open window suggested negligence rather than malice. Even Inspector Graves seemed inclined toward this interpretation, his questions directed more toward establishing facts than toward suggesting foul play. Yet Miss Marple found herself increasingly troubled by the particulars. She had observed enough death in her long life to recognize that most accidents carry the stamp of their own authenticity. They possess a certain slovenly quality, a randomness that distinguishes them from deliberate action. The positioning of Kirkwood's body, visible briefly as it had been carried from the terrace, suggested not the tumbling fall of an accidental descent, but rather the weighted, purposeful landing of something that had been placed rather than dropped. More troubling still were the facts emerging about the deceased himself. Inspector Graves, interviewing various guests, was beginning to assemble a portrait of a man whose arrival in St. Mary Mead had been neither casual nor welcome. Edward Carlyle, once his name had been properly established, was a solicitor of questionable reputation from London, known to handle delicate matters for certain sorts of clients. His presence at the garden party had been purely incidental. He had been staying at the Pemberton Manor as a guest, though the nature of his business remained unclear. "He came yesterday on some matter of legal business," Lady Pemberton explained to the inspector, her hands trembling slightly as she poured yet another cup of tea. "Though I confess I did not inquire too closely as to its nature. My nephew, that is, Susan's brother, had written to say that Mr. Kirkwood was an old family acquaintance who required temporary accommodation. I could hardly refuse. It was Colonel Ashford who provided the first genuinely useful information, delivered in his characteristically bluff manner. "Saw the fellow last evening," he said, settling himself heavily into an armchair. Out on the terrace he was, talking with young Susan. Seemed to be having rather a heated discussion, from what I could gather. The girl looked distinctly upset. This observation produced an immediate stir among the assembled guests. Susan Pemberton, who had been sitting quietly with her hands folded, seemed to shrink further into herself. Her eyes, when they briefly met Miss Marple's, carried an expression of such profound distress that the elderly woman felt a familiar pang of sympathy. She recognized that particular quality of fear, not the natural horror that tragedy produces, but the desperate apprehension of someone who perceives themselves to be in danger of suspicion. Inspector Graves, his interest visibly sharpening, turned his attention toward the girl. "Miss Pemberton, it would be helpful to understand the nature of your conversation with Mr. Kirkwood. It was recent, yes? Within the past 12 hours. Susan's response was barely audible. He wished to discuss certain family matters. Matters that I prefer not to discuss publicly. The inspector's expression grew significantly less sympathetic at this reticence. It was precisely the sort of vague, evasive answer that professional investigators found most illuminating. Where there was concealment, there was generally motive. And where there was motive, suspicion naturally followed. Miss Marple watched this interaction with profound attention, her knitting needles moving with steady rhythm. The appearance of Edward Carlyle at the periphery of events was becoming less mysterious and more troubling. What business had brought such a man to their village? Why had he been present when Kirkwood fell? And, most intriguingly, where precisely had he been at the moment of the tragedy? The evening descended gradually into an atmosphere of profound unease. Inspector Graves announced that he would be conducting individual interviews beginning the following morning, and that all guests would remain at Pemberton Manor pending the outcome of the preliminary investigation. No one, he stated with quiet authority, should consider themselves free to leave the village. As the guests dispersed toward their assigned bedrooms, Miss Marple remained by the window, gazing out into the darkening garden. The casement on the second floor was now closed, but she could still see it clearly, the window from which a man had fallen, or been pushed, or been thrown. Somewhere within this house, she reflected, resided a murderer who believed themselves cleverly hidden. The morning following Kirkwood's death dawned with that peculiar quality of indifference that nature so often displays toward human tragedy. The sun rose clear and warm, the birds sang their appointed songs, and the village of St. Mary Mead continued its ordinary rhythms, largely unaware of the drama unfolding within Pemberton Manor. Inspector Graves, having established himself in the study with a local constable as his assistant, began his systematic examination of the household and guests with methodical precision. Miss Marple had elected to take her breakfast early, in the small morning room that overlooked the garden. It was there that Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, found her sipping tea with an expression of serene contentment that belied the intensity of her observation. "Dreadful business, Miss Marple," Mrs. Finch said, settling herself into the chair across from the elderly woman with the familiarity of long acquaintance. The housekeeper had known Miss Marple for nearly 20 years and harbored no pretense in her presence. "I've been employed here for 8 years, and never has such a thing occurred. Poor Mr. Kirkwood, though I confess I cannot say I knew him well. Tell me, Miss Marple," Leigh said gently, setting down her teacup. "What was your impression of the gentleman when you showed him to his room yesterday afternoon?" Mrs. Finch considered this carefully, her weathered face creasing with the effort of recollection. "He seemed agitated, Miss Marple. Not angry precisely, but as though something weighed heavily upon him. He asked me to ensure the window was opened fully, said he required fresh air. I thought it unusual given the warmth of the day, but one does not question guests' preferences. This detail, seemingly insignificant, immediately claimed Miss Marple's attention. An open window suggested premeditation, or at the very least opportunity. Yet it also suggested something more, a person who wished others to believe his death an accident. What purpose would be served in requesting that a window be opened, unless one intended to create the appearance of accidental exposure to danger? "And the young lady, Miss Susan?" Miss Marple inquired. "Had you occasion to observe her interaction with Mr. Kirkwood?" Mrs. Finch's expression grew noticeably uncomfortable. "I saw them together on the terrace yesterday evening, as Colonel Ashford mentioned." Miss Susan seemed distressed. Mr. Kirkwood was speaking to her in what I can only describe as an urgent manner. When I passed near enough to notice, he broke off immediately and excused himself. The girl remained there for some time afterward, staring out at the gardens as though she had not truly seen them. Below them, through the morning-room window, the terrace presented an almost accusatory appearance. The spot where Kirkwood's body had been discovered was now merely an unmarked section of stone, yet Miss Marple found her gaze returning to it repeatedly. A fall from the window above would indeed produce precisely that positioning. She had observed enough of such matters to be certain. But the manner of the fall remained the crucial question. Accident, suicide, or murder? Each possibility carried its own particular signature, its own subtle grammar of physical evidence. The sound of raised voices emerged from the hallway, interrupting her contemplation. Inspector Graves was conducting his first formal interview, and the emotional temperature of the proceedings appeared to be rising. Through the partially open door, Miss Marple could hear fragments of conversation, Susan's voice, thin and strained, insisting upon her right to privacy, the inspector's calm but insistent questioning, and finally, the arrival of Lady Pemberton, intervening with the protective authority of a senior family member. It was this scene that drew Miss Marple into the hallway moments later, ostensibly en route to the garden room, but, in reality, seeking a clearer understanding of the morning's developments. She encountered Edward Carlyle near the study door, standing with the particular stillness of a man who has been listening intently to a conversation he was not meant to hear. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, long enough for Miss Marple to observe several things of considerable interest. Carlyle's expression contained no surprise at her appearance, suggesting he had been aware of her presence. More significantly, his pupils were dilated despite the bright morning light, and a faint tremor affected his left hand as he adjusted his cufflink. These were manifestations of anxiety, though whether born of guilt or mere stress remained to be determined. "Good morning, Mr. Carlyle," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I trust you slept adequately despite the distressing circumstances." His smile was practiced, polished by years of professional encounter. "As well as circumstances permitted, Miss Marple. It is a dreadful business, is it not? Poor Kirkwood. One does wonder how such an accident could have occurred." Miss Marple did not immediately respond, instead regarding him with the gentle but penetrating gaze that had caused more than one guilty person to confess their sins to her. She said simply, "Yes, one does wonder. So many questions remain unanswered, questions that I am certain Inspector Graves will methodically resolve," Carlyle said, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I myself have little to contribute. I was resting in my room when the tragedy occurred. I heard the commotion and emerged to find the household in considerable distress." "How fortunate," Miss Marple observed mildly, "that the inspector will be able to confirm your whereabouts through his investigation. It is always reassuring to have one's movements verified, is it not?" The faint crease that appeared between Carlyle's brows suggested that he recognized, if only obliquely, the trap implicit in her observation. He excused himself with visible alacrity, departing toward the morning room just as Inspector Graves emerged from the study, his expression grave and his notebook covered in the dense handwriting of a man accumulating precisely the sort of complications that made straightforward investigations infinitely more complex. Inspector Graves appeared distinctly troubled as he emerged from the study, his methodical demeanor fractionally diminished by the weight of complications he had begun to unearth. He noticed Miss Marple in the hallway, and, with the instinctive courtesy that had characterized his investigation thus far, approached her with a degree of deference. "Miss Marple," he said, "I wonder if I might impose upon your time for a brief conversation. You have resided in St. Mary Mead for a considerable period, I understand, and your observations regarding the village and its inhabitants might prove illuminating." They settled themselves in the small parlor, adjacent to tea. He studied, a room distinguished primarily by its collection of watercolor landscapes that conveyed no particular artistry but considerable expense. Inspector Graves, arranging his notebook with practiced precision, began with the sort of seemingly innocuous questions that gradually revealed his investigative strategy. "Your impression of Mr. Kirkwood, Miss Marple? You were present at the garden party when the tragedy occurred." "I observed him," Miss Marple said carefully, "though I cannot claim to have made his acquaintance. He appeared to be a man of some considerable anxiety. The sort of gentleman, I would venture, whose occupation requires him to maintain confidentiality regarding matters that might be considered sensitive or distressing to others." The inspector's eyes sharpened at this observation. "You perceived all this simply from observing him at a garden party?" "One develops certain sensibilities," Miss Marple replied with characteristic modesty, "through long years of observing human nature. Mr. Kirkwood's posture, his careful distance from the assembled company, the manner in which his eyes repeatedly sought out young Miss Pemberton. These details suggested a man whose presence carried weight beyond mere social courtesy." Inspector Graves made a notation, then proceeded with a question that Miss Marple recognized as having been prompted by his conversation with Susan. "Miss Pemberton appears to have had some prior acquaintance with the deceased. Did you observe any indication of their familiarity prior to yesterday?" "I did not," Miss Marple acknowledged, "though I confess I was not observing Miss Pemberton with particular attention until her evident distress became apparent. She has been in the village for only 6 weeks, I believe. A guest of Lady Pemberton while she determines her future course. Indeed." The inspector set down his pen momentarily. Mrs. Pemberton admits to knowing Kirkwood, though she is reluctant to specify the nature of their relationship. She insists it was merely family business of a confidential nature. Yet her distress seems to exceed what simple legal matters would typically produce. Miss Marple remained silent, a tactic she had perfected over decades of extracting information while offering none. This silence, she had learned, frequently prompted people to fill the void with revelations they had not intended to make. "There is another matter," the inspector continued, seemingly prompted by her quietude, "which troubles me considerably. I have been examining the room from which Mr. Kirkwood fell. The window, you see, would have required a certain force to open. It has not been properly maintained and has settled somewhat into its frame. Yet the housekeeper insists that Kirkwood requested it be opened fully, which she accomplished without particular difficulty. Moreover, there are marks upon the sill suggesting that someone stood upon it quite recently. The marks could be consistent with an accidental stumble, yet their positioning suggests a deliberate mounting of the sill, rather than a casual leaning out." "How very intriguing," Miss Marple murmured. "Such details must prove invaluable to your investigation. They would be, if they pointed in any consistent direction," the inspector said with evident frustration. "Instead, they suggest either that Mr. Kirkwood deliberately mounted the sill for some reason now obscure to us, or that someone else has been in that room since his death. Yet the room was sealed this morning, and no one has entered it prior to my examination." Miss Marple considered this revelation carefully. The placement of Kirkwood's body had indeed suggested deliberate positioning rather than accidental tumbling. But if the murder had occurred as she suspected, the murderer must have effected their escape quickly before the household discovered the body. This required not merely opportunity, but also precise knowledge of the household's rhythms and movements. "The household staff," Miss Marple inquired delicately, "have they all been accounted for?" One imagines that a person familiar with the manor's layout might navigate its corridors with considerably greater ease than a stranger. The inspector regarded her with a new expression, one that suggested he was beginning to appreciate the subtle nature of her observations. "You suspect an insider." "I suspect," Miss Marple said carefully, "that whoever caused Mr. Kirkwood's death possessed intimate knowledge of this house and the movements of its inhabitants. That knowledge need not indicate guilt in itself, but it does narrow considerably the field of persons capable of achieving both the act and its subsequent concealment." Before the inspector could respond, a commotion arose from the hallway. A servant was announcing the arrival of the coroner, who had come to conduct his preliminary examination of the body. Inspector Graves excused himself with evident relief, as though eager to escape the implications of Miss Marple's observations. Yet as he departed, Miss Marple remained in the small parlour, her fingers resuming their knitting with mechanical precision, while her mind engaged in far more complex operations. She had observed something during the morning's exchanges that no one else seemed to have noticed, something regarding the timing of events, the precise sequence of movements, and most significantly, a detail so minor that it had been entirely overlooked in the general shock and confusion. It involved a curtain, or rather the absence of a curtain where one should have been. It involved the peculiar quality of mud upon Edward Carlyle's shoes when he had passed her in the hallway. That could only have come from the terrace where Kirkwood had fallen. The pieces were beginning to align themselves into a pattern, not yet fully resolved, but increasingly coherent. And at the center of that pattern stood a lie so fundamental, yet so carefully constructed, that exposing it would require considerably more finesse than any crude interrogation. The coroner's preliminary findings, delivered to Inspector Graves that afternoon, confirmed what Miss Marple had already deduced from the positioning of the body. James Kirkwood had died from injuries consistent with a fall from considerable height, and the injuries themselves, particularly the fracturing of the skull and the peculiar arrangement of breaks along the spine, suggested that he had impacted the terrace with significant force and without any apparent attempt at self-protection. A person falling accidentally, the coroner noted, typically displayed defensive injuries from instinctive attempts to break their fall. Kirkwood possessed none of these telltale signs. The implication hung unspoken but profoundly significant in the study air. James Kirkwood had either been unconscious when he fell, or he had been deliberately positioned and released with calculated force. It was this revelation that seemed to crystallize the inspector's suspicions, transforming his investigation from a straightforward accident inquiry into a genuine murder hunt. By late afternoon, he had summoned all occupants of Pemberton Manor into the drawing room for what he termed a preliminary clarification of the morning's interviews. His tone had shifted noticeably, adopting the sharper edge of a man no longer extending the courtesy due to accident victims, but now addressing potential murderers. "Several points require clarification," the inspector announced, his gaze moving methodically across the assembled faces. "First, regarding Mr. Kirkwood's state of mind. Multiple witnesses have confirmed that he appeared agitated and distressed. Miss Pemberton, in particular, indicated that his conversation with her concerned matters of significant emotional weight. Yet she continues to refuse to disclose the nature of these matters, citing privacy concerns." Susan Pemberton, sitting rigid in a chair near the fireplace, seemed to shrink further into herself at this reference. Her hands trembled visibly, and her complexion had taken on a greyish pallor that spoke of genuine terror rather than mere embarrassment. Furthermore, the inspector continued, "I have been examining the deceased's personal effects. Among his possessions was a letter, partially drafted but never completed, which appears to reference financial irregularities and what might be construed as blackmail. This letter was addressed to an individual whose name was not written, but whose identity might be inferred from context. This revelation produced an immediate stir among the assembled company. Colonel Ashford shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Mrs. Hartley, the vicar's wife, gasped audibly, and Edward Carlyle, standing near the window with an appearance of studied indifference, seemed to momentarily lose his composure, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. It was this last observation that drew Miss Marple's focused attention. She had been watching Carlyle, with the intensity she ordinarily reserved to the most crucial moments of investigation, and his reaction to the mention of blackmail had been precisely the sort that suggested direct personal knowledge of the matter. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice cutting through the murmured conversations with surprising authority, "might I inquire whether you have examined Mr. Kirkwood's shoes?" The question, seemingly tangential and oddly specific, produced a moment of puzzled silence. Inspector Graves turned toward her with an expression mixing irritation at the interruption with a grudging respect for her investigative acumen. "His shoes, Miss Marple? What possible relevance?" The mud upon them, Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence, would indicate whether he had ventured onto the terrace prior to his fall. If he had been standing upon the sill deliberately, his shoes would bear traces of the particular composition of the terrace stones, would they not? Yet, if he had been carried there unconscious, his shoes would retain whatever mud he had accumulated in other locations. The inspector's eyes widened slightly, and he immediately dispatched his constable to retrieve Kirkwood's shoes from the evidence collection. While they awaited the constable's return, an oppressive silence descended upon the drawing room, the sort of silence that precedes either revelation or catastrophe. When the shoes arrived, the inspector examined them with renewed intensity. "Remarkably astute, Miss Marple," he acknowledged. "The shoes show minimal traces of terrace mud, yet considerable accumulation of a different composition. Reddish clay, it appears, the sort that might be found near the garden's western boundary, some considerable distance from the house." This detail, Miss Marple reflected, suggested that Kirkwood had been walking in the gardens, possibly unobserved by household members, at some point during the previous day. Had he been meeting someone? Had he discovered something that necessitated his death? The questions proliferated, yet certain answers remained frustratingly elusive. It was at this juncture that Edward Carlyle rose abruptly from his position near the window. "Inspector, I believe I must revise my earlier statement regarding my whereabouts during the relevant period," he said, his voice containing a quality of forced composure had fooled no one accustomed to recognizing the signs of deteriorating mental equilibrium. "Indeed," the inspector replied, his pen poised above his notebook. "I suggest you proceed with considerable care, Mr. Carlyle. False statements regarding one's location during a murder investigation carry serious legal consequences." Carlyle's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "I was not, as I previously indicated, resting in my room. I was actually examining the gardens on the western side of the property. Mr. Kirkwood had suggested that we meet there to discuss certain matters of mutual interest. When I arrived at the appointed location, he was not present. I waited for some time before returning to the house. I only learned of his death upon hearing the commotion that followed." Miss Marple listened to this revised account with profound attention. It contained just enough plausibility to be credible, yet sufficient ambiguity to raise numerous uncomfortable questions. Most significantly, it placed Carlyle in proximity to where Kirkwood had apparently been walking, and it suggested a clandestine meeting that neither man had previously acknowledged. The inspector's expression suggested that he harbored similar doubts. "Then perhaps, Mr. Carlyle, you might explain the precise nature of these matters of mutual interest that prompted such careful discretion." Edward Carlyle's composure, which had remained relatively intact despite the mounting pressure of the inspector's interrogation, visibly fractured at this direct challenge. He opened his mouth, closed it again, and then sank back into his chair, with the bearing of a man who has suddenly recognized the impossibility of his situation. When he finally spoke, his voice had acquired a hollow quality that suggested the abandonment of pretense. "The matter concerns certain financial obligations," Carlyle said slowly, as though each word required conscious effort to articulate. "Mr. Kirkwood had become aware of certain transactions that I had conducted on behalf of clients. Transactions that, while not strictly illegal, existed in a certain ambiguous territory regarding professional ethics. He indicated that he intended to bring these matters to the attention of the Law Society unless I agreed to certain financial arrangements." The admission hung in the drawing-room air like a confession, though Miss Marple recognized it for what it actually was, a carefully constructed partial truth designed to explain away his revised statement while concealing something considerably more significant. The inspector, however, seemed satisfied with this explanation, his eyes narrowing with the particular satisfaction of a man who has identified a motive substantial enough to warrant serious investigation. "You are, then, admitting to blackmail?" Inspector Graves asked with deliberate precision. "Mr. Kirkwood was extorting money from you?" "Not precisely extortion," Carlyle said, with the defensive quibbling of a man attempting to minimize the gravity of his admission. "Rather, a negotiation regarding the discretion he would exercise regarding certain professional matters. I agreed to provide him with a sum, and he agreed to maintain confidentiality regarding the transactions in question." Miss Marple, observing this exchange with her characteristic intensity, noted that Carlyle's hands remained steady throughout his explanation, and his breathing, while elevated, did not display the erratic patterns that genuine guilt typically produced. His performance was that of a man engaged in damage control, rather than a man confessing to murder. Moreover, his explanation, while damaging to his professional reputation, provided him with a motive that was simultaneously credible and remarkably mundane: Hardle. The sort of desperation that typically drove individuals to commit capital crimes. What troubled her more substantially was the question his revised narrative failed to adequately address. If Carlyle had been in the Western Gardens and Kirkwood had not appeared at the appointed meeting, where had Kirkwood actually been at that moment? The coroner's examination suggested that the fatal fall had occurred sometime between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. Carlyle's meeting was ostensibly scheduled for 3. The timing was precise enough to warrant considerable scrutiny. It was Susan Pemberton who provided the next crucial revelation, though not through any deliberate intention. As the inspector continued his questioning of Carlyle, she rose abruptly from her chair, her face flushed with what appeared to be a combination of anger and profound distress. "Mr. Carlyle is lying," she said, her voice trembling but possessing an unmistakable quality of conviction. "Or at least he is not telling the complete truth. I know why Mr. Kirkwood came to St. Mary Mead. I know what he intended to discuss with me, and I know that his discussion with Mr. Carlyle involved considerably more than professional discretion." The drawing room erupted into a chaos of overlapping voices and expressions of shock. Inspector Graves, recognizing that he was on the verge of obtaining information of substantial importance, immediately moved to restore order and redirect his attention toward the girl. "Miss Pemberton, I strongly advise you to consider carefully what you are about to state," he said with official gravity. "False accusations carry serious consequences." "I am aware of that," Susan replied, her chin lifted with a courage that seemed to surprise even herself. "But I am also aware that silence makes me complicit in whatever is occurring. Mr. Kirkwood was my father's solicitor. He came because my brother, Gerald, has been engaged in activities that require legal representation of a particularly discreet nature. The financial irregularities that Mr. Carlyle referenced were not conducted by Mr. Carlyle himself, but were rather conducted by my brother, using Mr. Carlyle's professional credentials as a means of concealment." This revelation produced an immediate and profound shift in the investigative landscape. The inspector's gaze, which had been focused upon Carlyle with suspicion, now began to broaden its scope to encompass the broader social and familial connections that surrounded the deceased. Miss Marple, however, found her attention fixating upon a detail that Susan's statement had inadvertently clarified. The letter found among Kirkwood's possessions had been addressed not to Carlyle, but to someone else entirely. Someone whose identity had been obscured, but whose involvement in the financial irregularities had been central to the blackmail scheme. "Where is your brother, Miss Pemberton?" the inspector demanded, his voice taking on a sharper edge. "He departed the village yesterday evening," Susan replied quietly. "He received a telephone call that appeared to distress him considerably. He stated that he was required to return to London on urgent business. I did not know at the time that Mr. Kirkwood was dead. I thought perhaps he had learned of the police investigation and was attempting to escape before charges could be brought against him." Inspector Graves immediately dispatched his constable to make inquiries regarding Gerald Pemberton's departure. Miss Marple, however, found herself occupied with a peculiar inconsistency that troubled her greatly. If Gerald Pemberton had departed the village before Kirkwood's death, as Susan's account suggested, then the murder could not have been a crime of passionate desperation of blackmail threats. Instead, it must have been calculated, deliberate, and engaged in for reasons that remained substantially obscured. She rose from her chair with the careful deliberation of age and approached the window that overlooked the gardens. The afternoon light was beginning to assume the golden quality that preceded evening, and the shadows cast by the manor's eastern wall were lengthening across the terrace below. It was then that she noticed something that appeared to have escaped everyone else's attention. A second set of footprints in the mud beneath the fatal window. Footprints that had been partially obscured by the disturbance caused by the discovery of the body, but which were nevertheless visible to anyone examining the ground with sufficient care. These footprints were distinctly smaller than Kirkwood's, and they appeared to have been made at a slightly different time, their edges less defined and their depth suggesting a considerably lighter individual. Miss Marple turned away from the window with a sudden clarity of purpose. The murder was not yet solved, though she now possessed a suspicion regarding its true architect, a suspicion so profound and so troubling that it would require the most delicate handling to expose without causing irreparable damage to innocent parties. The evening meal at Pemberton Manor was a subdued affair, conducted with all the awkward formality that murder investigations impose upon domestic routines. The assembled company ate with evident lack of appetite, conversation limited to the barest necessities, and the weight of unspoken accusations hanging over the dining table with almost palpable presence. Inspector Graves had established himself in the study with his constable and a growing collection of documents and statements, while the household staff moved through their duties with the mechanical precision of people. engaged in familiar tasks while their minds occupied entirely different territories. Miss Marple, having excused herself from the formal meal with a delicate reference to her age and the fatiguing nature of recent events, retired to her assigned bedroom on the first floor. This room, situated at a considerable distance from the main guest quarters, offered both privacy and a strategic vantage point from which to observe the household's movements. She settled herself into the comfortable armchair positioned near the window, her knitting abandoned in favor of concentrated thought, and began the methodical process of assembling the disparate elements of the case into coherent patterns. The footprints beneath the fatal window constituted the most significant revelation thus far. They suggested that someone other than Kirkwood had been present at the moment of his death, someone considerably lighter in frame, almost certainly female in physiognomy, and possessed of sufficient knowledge of the household to access the guest room without exciting suspicion. The natural conclusion, that Susan Pemberton had been present at the death, seemed almost too obvious, too convenient, and therefore necessarily wrong. Miss Marple had learned long ago that murderers rarely engaged in such transparent behavior as to leave evidence pointing directly toward themselves. No, there was something more subtle at work here, something that required understanding not merely what had occurred, but the deeper question of why it had occurred, and what circumstances had necessitated such a drastic solution. The blackmail scheme, as Carlyle had described it, hardly seemed sufficient motive for murder. Blackmail was a recurring problem for men in Carlyle's profession. It was managed through financial accommodation and discretion. Kirkwood's death, by contrast, suggested desperation of a far more profound nature. A soft knock upon her door at 9:30 interrupted her contemplations. Miss Marple, unsurprised by this interruption, invited the visitor to enter with a calm that suggested she had been expecting precisely this development. Inspector Graves entered, looking considerably more fatigued than he had that morning, his collar loosened and his expression betraying the strain of an investigation that was multiplying in complexity rather than simplifying toward resolution. "I confess, Miss Marple," he said, settling himself into the chair opposite her with evident relief, "that your observations have proven invaluable to my investigation. Your comment regarding the shoes and subsequently your apparent interest in the footprints beneath the window suggest that you have developed theories regarding this matter that extend considerably beyond my own preliminary conclusions. I wonder whether you might be willing to share your thoughts." Miss Marple regarded him with the gentle but penetrating gaze that had characterized her demeanor throughout the investigation. "The facts, Inspector, are these. Mr. Kirkwood arrived in St. Mary Mead with knowledge of financial irregularities that exposed multiple individuals to potential criminal prosecution. He was prepared to use this knowledge as leverage for financial gain. Yet his death, while appearing at first to be accidental, was in fact deliberately engineered by someone possessed of considerable familiarity with both the household and the individuals involved. What remains obscure is the precise identity of this person and the specific motivation that necessitated such an extreme action. You perceive, then, that the murder was premeditated rather than crime of passion?" the inspector inquired. "Undoubtedly," Miss Marple replied. "A crime of passion would have resulted in a considerably more chaotic scene. This death bears the hallmarks of careful planning and precise execution. The request that the window be opened, the timing of events, the selection of a method that would appear accidental, all suggest someone who had considered the implications of their action with considerable foresight." Inspector Graves made a notation in his ever-present notebook. Yet Gerald Pemberton, the most obvious suspect given his financial improprieties, had already departed the village when Kirkwood died. This fact would seem to complicate any theory suggesting his direct involvement. "Indeed it would," Miss Marple acknowledged, "if we operated under the assumption that Gerald Pemberton's departure was what it appeared to be. However, I would venture to suggest that his departure was considerably more calculated than Susan indicated. He did not flee in fear of prosecution, but rather in the knowledge that Kirkwood would soon no longer be available to prosecute." The inspector's eyes widened at this implication. "You suggest that Gerald Pemberton orchestrated his own cousin's murder?" "I suggest," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Gerald Pemberton possessed the motive and the foreknowledge necessary to arrange such an event. However, he could not personally execute the murder without exposing himself to immediate suspicion. Therefore, he must have employed someone else, someone within the household, someone whose presence would not excite comment, and someone to whom he had sufficient influence to ensure their cooperation." "But who?" the inspector demanded with visible frustration. "Who within this household possessed both the access and the willingness to commit such an act?" Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate precision. "That, Inspector, is a question that requires considerably more delicate investigation than your current methodology permits. I suggest that you examine not the statements of the accused, but rather the silences, the details that people have omitted from their accounts, the moments when their composure fractured, and most significantly, the relationships that exist beneath the surface of household civility." "You are speaking in riddles, Miss Marple," the inspector said, though his tone suggested frustration rather than genuine anger. "I am speaking," Miss Marple corrected gently, "in the language of human nature, which is rarely direct and frequently obscured by considerations of loyalty, shame, and the desperate desire to protect those whom we love. Your investigation thus far has focused upon identif. Ying a murderer, but perhaps what you require is to identify the person for whom the murder was committed." Inspector Graves departed shortly thereafter, his mind clearly engaged in the complex process of reassessing the evidence and the relationships that surrounded it. Miss Marple remained in her chair, gazing out into the darkened garden, where, somewhere in the shadows, the answer to Kirkwood's death existed in the form of human motivation so powerful that it had overcome even the fundamental prohibition against taking another's life. She thought of Susan's distress, of Carlyle's carefully constructed lies, of the household staff who moved through the manor with their own unspoken burdens, and she thought of the smaller footprints beneath the window, footprints that belonged to someone who had believed, with complete conviction, that they were acting not for their own benefit, but for the protection of someone they loved. Tomorrow, Miss Marple reflected, would bring the final revelations. Tonight she would allow her unconscious mind to work through the remaining complexities, assembling the final pieces into a pattern that, once revealed, would seem inevitable and obvious. The morning that followed dawned with the peculiar brightness that sometimes appears after significant emotional turbulence, as though nature itself were indifferent to human suffering and capable only of continuing its appointed cycles. Inspector Graves, having spent a considerable portion of the night reviewing statements and reconsidering the evidence through the lens of Miss Marple's cryptic suggestions, appeared noticeably more haggard, but also more purposeful in his demeanor. He had called for a second round of formal interviews, and this time his questions carried a sharper edge, suggesting that his investigative direction had fundamentally altered. Miss Marple took her breakfast alone in the morning room, observing through the window as the household stirred to consciousness. It was there that Mrs. Finch found her, the housekeeper's typically composed expression showing distinct signs of strain. She sat heavily in the chair across from the elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the teacup that Miss Marple had anticipated and prepared for her arrival. "Dreadful times, Miss Marple," the housekeeper said quietly, her voice reduced to barely above a whisper. "The inspector's questions have taken a most troubling turn. He seems to suggest that someone within the household was responsible for Mr. Kirkwood's death. I cannot fathom how such a thing could be possible. We are a respectable establishment, and the staff have been with Lady Pemberton for years." Miss Marple regarded the woman with gentle but penetrating attention. Mrs. Finch had been employed at Pemberton Manor for 8 years, which meant she had witnessed the household's evolution through multiple iterations and had accumulated knowledge of its inhabitants' habits and secrets that exceeded that of any other individual. Moreover, her position granted her access to all areas of the house, and her movements would excite no suspicion whatsoever. "Tell me, Mrs. Finch," Miss Marple said softly, "when you showed Mr. Kirkwood to his room yesterday afternoon, did you observe anything that struck you as unusual? Any indication that he possessed information that might disturb the household's equilibrium?" The housekeeper's hands clenched around her teacup, and her gaze became fixed upon the table before her with a quality of intense concentration. When she spoke, her voice had acquired an almost mechanical quality, as though she were reciting information rather than engaging in genuine conversation. "He seemed troubled," Mrs. Finch said slowly, "more than merely agitated, as I menti," woned to the inspector. He appeared to be a man bearing news that he knew would cause considerable distress to those who heard it. "I thought perhaps he was about to deliver word of a death in the family. Such was the gravity of his bearing." "And did you observe any interaction between Mr. Kirkwood and other household members prior to his death?" Miss Marple pressed gently. The housekeeper's composure, already fragile, seemed to fracture further at this question. Her eyes, when they finally met Miss Marple's, contained an expression of profound anguish combined with a desperate plea for understanding. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Finch said, her voice dropping even further, "I have served this household faithfully for 8 years. I have cared for Lady Pemberton's comfort and maintained her home to the best of my abilities. But I have also come to care deeply for the younger members of this family, and I confess that I have become aware of certain circumstances that place them in considerable jeopardy." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion arose from the hallway. Inspector Graves was summoning all occupants of the manor to the drawing-room for what he termed a critical development in his investigation. Mrs. Finch rose quickly, her expression returning to its professional composure, though her trembling hands betrayed her underlying distress. Miss Marple followed at a more leisurely pace, her mind assembling the final elements of a puzzle that was rapidly approaching its resolution. The drawing-room presented a tableau of considerable tension. Susan Pemberton sat rigid in her chair, her complexion ashen and her eyes fixed upon some point beyond the room's physical confines. Edward Carlyle stood near the fireplace, his earlier composure entirely abandoned, replaced by a visible agitation that manifested in constant small movements of his hands and feet. Colonel Ashford and Mrs. Hartley occupied chairs near the window, their expressions reflecting the mingled horror and fascination that such situations invariably produced. And Lady Pemberton herself sat with the bearing of a woman whose world had fundamentally shifted and who was struggling to comprehend the new landscape that was emerging around her. Inspector Graves positioned himself before the assembled company with the gravity of a man about to announce findings that would alter multiple lives irreparably. "During my investigation," he began, "I have come to certain conclusions regarding the circumstances of Mr. Kirkwood's death that require immediate clarification. Upon re-examination of the evidence, particularly the footprints discovered beneath the fatal window and the witness statements regarding movements within the household during the relevant period, I have developed a theory regarding the manner in which this crime was committed." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle upon the assembled company. "The evidence suggests that Mr. Kirkwood was indeed murdered, and that his murder was engineered by 2 individuals working in concert. One provided the planning and foreknowledge, the other provided the physical execution. Furthermore," he continued, "the motive for this crime was not simple financial gain or revenge for blackmail, but rather the protection of a family member from devastating exposure and potential criminal prosecution. Someone within this household valued their family loyalty above the legal consequences of murder." Miss Marple watched carefully as Inspector Graves made his revelation. His gaze moved across the assembled faces, and it was at this moment that she perceived the crucial detail that had eluded even his observant investigation. It was not Susan who displayed the profound fear of imminent exposure, but rather Mrs. Finch, who had posy, shunned herself near the doorway and whose hands gripped the frame with white-knuckled intensity. The housekeeper's eyes, when they met Miss Marple's, contained an unspoken message of resignation. She had already understood the inevitable conclusion that the investigation was approaching, and more significantly, she had already made her peace with the consequences. Inspector Graves, noticing the direction of Miss Marple's gaze, seemed to experience a moment of sudden clarity. His expression shifted as he recognized the implications of Mrs. Finch's positioning and demeanor. The constable, stationed near the doorway, moved with subtle deliberation to ensure that the housekeeper could not attempt an exit. Yet Mrs. Finch made no move to flee. Instead, she simply stood with her hands still gripping the doorframe, as though the physical contact with solid matter provided some anchor to reality that was rapidly dissolving around her. "Mrs. Finch," Inspector Graves said, his voice carrying a note of careful authority, "I would appreciate it if you would sit down. There are questions that require your careful consideration." The housekeeper lowered herself into the nearest chair with the movements of a woman bearing considerable weight. When she looked up, her expression had transformed entirely. The professional composure that had characterized her demeanor throughout the investigation had been replaced by something far more profound, a visible anguish combined with a desperate conviction that what she had done possessed some species of justification. "Before you proceed, Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, rising from her seat with the careful deliberation of age, "I believe there are certain considerations that might illuminate the circumstances of this crime more thoroughly than a straightforward interrogation would permit." The inspector regarded her with a mixture of frustration and deference. "Miss Marple, while I appreciate your insights, this is now a matter for official investigation. I must insist upon conducting my interviews according to proper procedure." "Indeed," Miss Marple acknowledged, "and I would not suggest otherwise. However, I believe that understanding the relationship between Mrs. Finch and certain members of this household would provide context that might otherwise remain obscure. May I ask, Inspector, whether you have investigated Mrs. Finch's family circumstances?" The question hung in the air with peculiar significance. Inspector Graves consulted his notebook, then looked up with dawning comprehension. "According to the household records, Mrs. Finch has a daughter. The records indicate that this daughter is currently residing in London and is employed in secretarial work. However, there is a gap in the documented information regarding the daughter's origins and earlier circumstances." Mrs. Finch's composure fractured entirely at this reference. Tears began streaming down her face, and her hands twisted together with visible distress. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible, "please do not force me to speak of her. Whatever I have done, she had no knowledge of it. She is innocent of everything except the accident of being my child." It was at this moment that the full implications of the case began to crystallize into comprehensible form. Miss Marple, whose long years of observation had granted her an almost preternatural understanding of human motivation, recognized the fundamental truth that had driven Mrs. Finch to commit murder, a mother's desperate attempt to protect her child from consequences that she perceived as catastrophic. "Gerald Pemberton," Miss Marple said softly, addressing the drawing room at large, "did not merely know of the financial irregularities that Mr. Kirkwood intended to expose. He was responsible for them. But the financial irregularities were not conducted for Gerald's own benefit. They were conducted to conceal something far more significant, something that involved a person to whom multiple members of this household bore deep emotional attachment." Lady Pemberton's expression suddenly shifted from confusion to understanding, and her hand moved to her mouth as though to suppress an involuntary exclamation. Edward Carlyle, meanwhile, had gone entirely still, his professional demeanor finally abandoned in favor of raw recognition. "Mrs. Finch's daughter," Miss Marple continued with gentle precision, "is Gerald Pemberton's biological child. An illegitimate relationship formed years ago when Gerald was younger and considerably less careful regarding the consequences of his actions. The relationship was conducted in secret, and the child was raised believing Mrs. Finch to be her mother in fact, rather than merely in social designation. When Gerald subsequently married and established himself as a respectable member of society, the relationship was terminated, though financial support was provided through the financial arrangements that Mr. Kirkwood had discovered. The silence that followed this revelation was profound and absolute. Mrs. Finch's shoulders had collapsed inward, and she made no attempt to deny the accuracy of Miss Marple's deduction. Instead, she simply sat with the bearing of a woman whose worst fears had finally materialized. "Mr. Kirkwood's intention," Miss Marple proceeded, "was not merely to expose Gerald's financial improprieties. It was to expose the existence of the child, and to use that knowledge as additional leverage in his blackmail scheme. This would have resulted in the complete destruction of Gerald's marriage, his social standing, and most significantly, the revelation to his daughter of the circumstances of her birth in the most humiliating possible manner. For Mrs. Finch, who had spent years protecting her daughter from this knowledge, the prospect of such exposure became unbearable. Therefore, Inspector, Graves said, understanding beginning to dawn across his features, Mrs. Finch conspired with Gerald to eliminate the threat that Kirkwood represented. Not conspired, precisely, Miss Marple said gently. I believe Gerald made his intentions clear to Mrs. Finch, perhaps inadvertently, or perhaps with the conscious knowledge that she possessed the means and the opportunity to act. He then removed himself from the village, establishing an alibi that would make his direct involvement impossible to prove. Mrs. Finch, acting from maternal desperation rather than criminal malice, took the opportunity that presented itself. Mrs. Finch finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I did not intend to kill him, she said. I only wished to speak with him, to implore him to show mercy, to explain what his actions would do to an innocent girl who had already suffered from the circumstances of her birth. But when he laughed at me, when he made clear that her suffering was of no consequence to him, something within me simply broke. I pushed him toward the window. I did not think. I did not plan. I simply acted. The confession hung in the drawing room with the finality of a death sentence pronounced. The confession seemed to drain the final reserves of Mrs. Finch's strength. She slumped in her chair, her hands falling limp to her lap, her eyes fixed upon some internal landscape that no longer contained hope or the possibility of redemption. Inspector Graves, recognizing the significance of this admission, immediately cautioned her regarding her legal rights and began the formal process of documenting her statement. Yet beneath the procedural necessities, something more subtle as occurring. A moment of profound human reckoning in which the consequences of desperate action became irrevocably manifest. Lady Pemberton rose from her chair with visible effort, her aged frame seeming to have accumulated additional years in the moments since Mrs. Finch's confession. She approached the housekeeper with movements that suggested considerable internal conflict, and for a moment it appeared that she might speak. Instead, she simply placed her hand upon Mrs. Finch's shoulder in a gesture that contained no judgment, but rather a complex acknowledgement of human weakness and the terrible choices that sometimes confronted those attempting to protect the vulnerable. Susan Pemberton, meanwhile, had begun to weep silently, her hand covering her face as she grappled with the implications of her brother's actions and their consequences. The knowledge that Gerald's pursuit of financial impropriety had ultimately resulted in a woman's destruction seemed to carry a weight that exceeded even the horror of murder itself. Edward Carlyle stood motionless near the fireplace, his expression containing a curious mixture of relief and renewed anxiety, as though he recognized that while one mystery had been resolved, his own precarious position remained substantially unaltered by these revelations. It was Miss Marple who broke the profound silence that had settled upon the drawing room. She moved toward Mrs. Finch with the careful deliberation of age, her expression carrying neither condemnation nor excessive sympathy, but rather the complex understanding of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the terrible arithmetic by which human beings calculated the consequences of their choices. Mrs. Finch, Miss Marple said gently, settling herself into the chair beside the housekeeper. In my many years of observation, I have come to understand that murder rarely occurs as the result of simple malice or calculated cruelty. More commonly, it emerges from the collision of desperation with opportunity, from the moment when a person recognizes that the mechanisms of law and society offer no protection for those they love. You did not kill Mr. Kirkwood because you wished him dead. You killed him because you perceived no alternative means by which to protect your daughter from devastation. Mrs. Finch's shoulders convulsed with suppressed sobs at this recognition. Inspector Graves, observing the interaction, seemed to comprehend that Miss Marple was engaged in something more complex than mere investigation. She was bearing witness to the human dimensions of the crime that extended far beyond the technical circumstances of its commission. That understanding, Inspector Graves said quietly, does not alter the legal reality of what has occurred. A woman is dead, and a crime has been committed. The courts will determine appropriate consequences. Indeed they will, Miss Marple agreed without contradiction. Justice, as administered by courts and laws, operates according to principles that must remain consistent regardless of the individual circumstances that produced the transgression. Yet justice, properly understood, encompasses more than mere legal consequence. It includes recognition of the conditions that produced the crime and the acknowledgement of the human dimensions that extend beyond simple culpability. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the local solicitor, summoned by Inspector Graves to ensure that proper legal procedures were observed. This gentleman, a competent professional named Mr. Harrison, immediately established himself beside Mrs. Finch and began the preliminary discussions regarding her legal representation. The atmosphere of the drawing room shifted from one of emotional reckoning to one of institutional process. The familiar machinery of the legal system beginning its methodical work of transforming human tragedy into documented fact and legal precedent. Over the subsequent hours, the household at Pemberton Manor gradually returned to something approximating normal function, though the normalcy was distinctly altered and fundamentally compromised by awareness of what had occurred within its walls. Inspector Graves conducted additional interviews, gathering the details that would form the basis of his formal report. Mrs. Finch, having consulted with her solicitor, provided a complete and detailed account of her actions on the day of Kirkwood's death, an account that confirmed in precise detail the reconstruction that Miss Marple had articulated. She had indeed. The morning that followed brought with it a peculiar quality of finality, combined with the persistent ache that comes when communities must confront uncomfortable truths about their members. St. Mary Mead, that haven of apparent respectability and social order, had been forced to acknowledge that beneath its carefully maintained facade existed the same capacity for desperation and moral transgression that characterized humanity in all its manifestations. The village would recover, as villages inevitably do, but it would recover with an altered understanding of itself and the people who inhabited its lanes and gardens. Miss Marple stood in the morning room of Pemberton Manor, observing the gardens one final time before her departure. The roses that Lady Pemberton had tended with such care continued their blooming, indifferent to the human drama that had unfolded within sight of their petals. The south lawn, where the garden party had occurred with such apparent serenity merely days before, had already resumed its ordinary function. Life, Miss Marple reflected, possessed a remarkable capacity to efface the traces of Eve. And significant events. Inspector Graves had departed that morning, carrying with him the documentation that would constitute the official record of James Kirkwood's murder and Mrs. Finch's culpability. The constable who had assisted him had driven away in the police automobile, leaving behind only the residual awareness of their presence and the knowledge that formal legal proceedings would eventually follow. Gerald Pemberton, apprehended in London before he could establish more distant refuge, would face his own legal consequences regarding the financial irregularities that had ultimately precipitated the tragedy. The machinery of justice, having been engaged, would continue its inevitable operation according to patterns established by centuries of legal precedent. Yet it was not the formal resolution of the case that occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as she prepared for her departure. Rather, it was the question of what justice truly meant when measured against the complexity of human motivation and the terrible choices that sometimes confronted those attempting to preserve dignity and protect the vulnerable. Mrs. Finch had committed murder. This was indisputably true. The law would judge her accordingly, and the courts would impose whatever penalty was deemed appropriate by legal standards. Yet the circumstances that had produced that moment of desperate violence possessed their own species of tragic legitimacy that extended beyond simple culpability. Susan Pemberton approached Miss Marple in the morning room, her bearing considerably more composed than it had been during the days of investigation, though her eyes still carried the marked effect of her recent suffering. The girl seated herself beside the elderly woman with the informal ease of someone who had begun to recognize in Miss Marple a quality of understanding that transcended ordinary social convention. "Ish to thank you, Miss Marple," Susan said quietly. "Before you departed, your actions, while exposing my brother's involvement and Mrs. Finch's culpability, did so with a gentleness that I confess I did not anticipate. You might have been far more direct, far more publicly damaging. Instead, you seem to understand that there were innocent people whose lives would be devastated by the revelation." Miss Marple regarded the girl with an expression of genuine affection. "My dear, the purpose of investigation is not to maximize suffering or public humiliation. Rather, it is to establish truth in a manner that allows society to understand what has occurred and why. The guilty must face justice, yes, but that justice need not be administered with cruelty or excessive public degradation. Mrs. Finch will face the consequences of her actions, but she will face them with the knowledge that those who understand human nature recognize the desperation that drove her to that moment." "What will happen to her?" Susan asked, her voice containing evident concern despite the complications of the housekeeper's actions that remains to be determined by the courts. Miss Marple said gently. "Justice, when properly administered, attempts to balance culpability against circumstance, malice against desperation. Mrs. Finch did not kill Mr. Kirkwood from simple wickedness. She killed him from the profound desire to protect her daughter from devastating harm. The courts may recognize this distinction, or they may not. But at the very least, the truth regarding her motivations will be recorded and acknowledged." Lady Pemberton appeared in the doorway moments later, accompanied by her solicitor, to discuss the arrangements for Miss Marple's departure and to express the gratitude of the household for her role in resolving the tragedy that had disrupted their domestic peace. The conversation as cordial and formal as such conversations between people of different social standings tended to be, yet it carried beneath its surface an awareness that genuine understanding had been established between them despite the conventional barriers that ordinarily separated them. By midday, Miss Marple found herself in the automobile that would return her to her own modest house in St. Mary Mead, carrying with her the mental notes and observations that would gradually transform themselves into the accumulated wisdom that characterized her understanding of human nature. The village streets seemed unchanged as she traveled through them, yet she recognized that every resident had been altered in some subtle fashion by the events of the preceding days. Murder, Miss Marple reflected, possessed a peculiar capacity to transform communities in ways that extended far beyond the formal consequences imposed by law. As the automobile approached her cottage, she gazed out at the familiar landscapes that had formed the backdrop of her observations for so many decades. The church spire that marked the village's spiritual center, the gardens that displayed the careful cultivation of people with leisure and inclination to tend them, the lanes that had witnessed countless human dramas, both significant and trivial. All of it continued according to patterns that had been established long before and would persist long after her own eventual departure from this earthly existence. She had learned nothing that was fundamentally new regarding human nature through the investigation of Kirkwood's murder. Rather, she had simply encountered once again the eternal truths that governed human behavior, that desperation frequently overcame morality, that love and loyalty could drive people to transgress the boundaries of law, that the respectable facade of communities concealed depths of complexity that rarely surfaced in ordinary social interaction. These were lessons that Miss Marple had internalized decades ago through observation of the village and its inhabitants. As her housekeeper welcomed her home and began the familiar routine of restoring her cottage to its accustomed order, Miss Marple settled into her chair with her knitting and allowed her mind to gradually shift from the complications of Pemberton Manor back to the ordinary rhythms of village life. Yet something had altered within the community, a recognition that injustice and tragedy did not occur only in distant cities or among people of dubious character, but could manifest anywhere, among anyone, when circumstances and desperation created the conditions for their emergence. The roses of St. Mary Mead continued their blooming, indifferent to the knowledge that human nature, for all its capacity for civility and restraint, remained fundamentally capable of terrible things when love and protection of the vulnerable were placed in opposition to the requirements of law and social order.